Welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I'm Hugh Blair-Smith. Today's book gets one of my favorite reviewing phrases, meticulously researched. Run the Storm, A Savage Hurricane, A Brave Crew, and the Wreck of the SS El Faro by George Michelsen Foy. George, welcome to Books in the World.
Thank you, Hugh.
If you look closely at George, you could swear it's really G.F. Michelsen, and you'd be right, because he also writes under that name. He has published 15 books of fiction and nonfiction, almost all, or is it really all, about those who go down to the sea in ships and boats.
Not quite all.
Not quite all. And has won several fellowships and awards. Now, George is also a Cape Cod native. We always like to see that, like to see native authors making good here. And of course, on Cape Cod, we're always aware of the shipwrecks that have occurred around our shores for centuries, hundreds, thousands perhaps, in our books, and printed on our very placemats. Recently, we've gotten used to a great rarity of shipwrecks, demanding to know what caused each one, and pushing for reforms to prevent more. And I'll come back to that point in a moment, but I want right now to ask, I gather that large parts of your life have functioned as preparation for writing Run the Storm, and would you tell us something about that?
Well, yeah, starting from before I could walk, I think I was sailing on our family's sailboat, but subsequently I worked as a fisherman out of Chatham and Falmouth, and actually before that I worked on British coastal freighters, basically tramp freighters around the North Sea, working my way up to mate on those ships. And then after that, I actually was when I was fishing on the Cape. And since then, I've been sailing on my own account and have a Coast Guard license, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, getting back to the greater rarity of shipwrecks. First of all, can you comment, do you agree that shipwrecks are almost infinitely rarer than, say, 150 years ago?
Yeah, and especially in contrast to before that, obviously now you've got a ton of navigational technical stuff that will keep a ship relatively safe. The ships are much bigger and stronger, and also we have, at least in countries like the United States or the UK, you have big regulatory systems that keep track of how the ships are built and how they're manned. And now, thanks to satellite technology in particular, you have the ability to keep track of the ships wherever they are. In fact, you can do it on your home computer and look up where a ship is at a given time, thanks to AIS, which is the automatic identification system. And so, thanks to that, obviously, you know where the ships are, and you know where the weather is too. That's a huge part of it. That certainly becomes relevant in terms of this book, but technically and theoretically and in practice, you really can keep track of where the fronts are and where the storms are, and you can guide ships around them. Yeah,
and of course we know of some notable failures of the weather system, 1979 at Fastnet,
right,
and of course this story also with Joaquin going where no sensible hurricane would be expected to go. Anyhow, the overarching theme of this book, it seems to me, is how a major catastrophe can be the sum of many minor mistakes, what you might call death by 1,000 shortcuts. Some degree of blame goes to the design and especially the redesign of the ship, some to the shipping line, some to climate change, some to several agencies of the U.S. government, some to harried longshoremen, and some to the 33 individuals, the officers and crew of the El Faro, most of whom get fairly compassionate biographies here. Did I miss anything?
No, you didn't. But in that summary, there's, as you say, there's thousands and thousands of details that go into not only running a ship, but also explaining why things work and then how they don't work, and how those can accumulate in ways that threaten the safety of a ship. And what interested me in the story was kind of the quantum details, the way really tiny events in terms of crew psychology in terms of steel composition, structure of the ship, how you put together a weather forecast, all of these. And in fact, there's politics that come into it. There's business decisions, there's business pressures. I mean, if you keep digging down into what happened with the ship, you come up with an almost infinite number of factors that go into it. And a ship this big, she was almost 800 feet long, like an 80-story skyscraper laid down on its side. It's a huge ship, and a ship that big almost becomes like its own world. There's so many different complex systems that go into running a ship like that, and they can go wrong.
Yes, and you do in a few places compare it to a living creature with its the amount of bending and writhing and twisting it does in serious ways.
When you sail, you start to feel that way about a ship. You get to know her particularities and her qualities and her faults. And this ship was actually kind of well loved by her crew. She was an old ship, but she was very seaworthy and fast. And a lot of her crew placed a lot of faith in her, and that came into the equation.
It's very much part of the equation. I want to get into one thing that's struck me particularly, the erosion, the fairly recent erosion of an ancient and enduring principle of seafaring: the captain's word is law. And I felt that Captain Mike Davidson had been badly broken by violations of that principle from the corporate structures above him.
Well, there's always been pressure on ships' masters to perform and to maximize profits.
Right.
And in fact, there's a passage in a Joseph Conrad novel that I cite in this book, where the captain of a given ship states exactly the problem that Michael Davidson, the captain of the El Faro, had to face, which is that if you delay a ship because of weather, there are going to be questions from head office saying, well, this cost us so many thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, and what happened? And well, we had to get around the weather. Well, okay, fine, but your ship's fine. Basically that's the pressure. And Davidson was facing that. He thought he had been canned from a previous company for making a safety decision that cost that company money. He thought he was possibly being fired by this company, and he did not want to slow the ship down any further than he had to because of this hurricane that was coming from the north and east.
The other half of Davidson's problem that I saw was that it's sort of a workstation setup kind of issue that requires him to be a stateroom captain for too much of the time, limiting his ability to engage with the crew. And how largely does that figure in your perception?
Well, there were various opinions, and of course, everybody on the ship died, so you could not get direct statements from them. But he was considered a stateroom captain by some of the officers in the company. Some of the crew contradicted that. They said he was actually quite hands-on. But the fact of the matter is that at one crucial point in this voyage where the hurricane was bearing down on the ship, and Davidson and his senior officers had some disagreements about how close they were going to come. The ship sank at 7:30 on October 1st, 2015. At roughly 8 p.m. on the 30th of September, the day before, Davidson turned in and presumably stayed in his stateroom till 4 a.m. the next morning, which was roughly 3.5 hours before the ship went down. And it was a time at that point where the ship was fully engaged with the hurricane. There were only so many things that the crew could do to save her at that point. In fact, there were only probably two options available for safety at that point. And Davidson had been asleep at a crucial point of the voyage and in his stateroom, to answer your question whether he was a stateroom captain. I'm hesitant to say that he was a stateroom captain. I mean, I think this was also a voyage that they were really used to. They did this regularly, Jacksonville, Florida to Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico back every 2 weeks, and normally a fairly calm run, except in hurricane season.
Exactly, it's a milk run, except when it isn't.
Yeah, exactly. And so there was an element of complacency, not just on Davidson's part, but on the company's part and on the crew's part. That does not obviate the fact that they should have been careful. You always have to be careful
Right.
At sea, obviously.
Well, it certainly struck me that Davidson was probably more badly wounded in this dimension than anyone else, from his experience with the previous company particularly.
Wounded in the sense that he was feeling pressure, or
that he was going to be subject to pressure and less able to be a captain's word is law type of captain.
Well, again, I mean, I think this pressure has existed since there were merchant ships, but more so now, where companies have the ability to really keep track of what the ships are doing. But Tote Maritime, which owned this ship, there was a series of companies, but they all belonged to one private company in Seattle. They were relatively hands-off in terms of their surveillance of the ship, if you will. They relied almost exclusively on the noon report when the captain radios position and general condition of the ship at noontime every day. Some ships companies will track the ship by satellite, and they'll know exactly where the ship is in relation to weather patterns. They will advise the ship's captain where to go. I mean, you have ships now that are capable of being fully automated, having no crew, no captain, and this ship was more on the traditional side, where the captain had actually more authority than not, but he still was very much feeling the pressure, and he was feeling the pressure individually because of his history, and because and there had been a previous captain with Tote who had, in his estimation, been fired because he had reported some safety violations to the Coast Guard. So there was a real pressure from the company, I think it's fair to say, to just keep navigating, keep costs down. Safety's okay. We're okay on that side. We're not going to worry too much about it.
Okay. All of the people involved, not just the captain, all of the people had good motives and professionalism. Seems all doing their best as they understood it. Yet that best wasn't equal to the predicament. Is there anybody who'd like to strike from that generalization?
There was anybody
that you would like to say maybe wasn't really doing their best, wasn't really motivated, properly motivated?
No, I think everybody had good intentions on the company side as well as on the ship. I tend to react strongly to a fairly common opinion, which is that this was all down to the captain. He made a mistake, he came too close to a hurricane. And I would say that that's obviously a huge component of what happened. But he was a master mariner. He was very good at his trade. He certainly made a mistake, but he also made a mistake on a ship that arguably could have survived even the situation that he put the ship in by bringing her closer to the hurricane than she should have come. And I liken it to a driver with a car that's being maintained by a certain garage, and they don't take good enough care of the brakes. And the driver goes too fast and tailgates and has an emergency situation where the driver has to stomp on the brakes, and the brakes fail or don't work correctly and hits the car in front. So there's a combination of both factors that came into that accident, and that's the kind of thing happened with Alfaro.
That kind of leads into my next angle, if you want to call it that, which is that you do a great job, I think, of training the reader to understand many of the issues in merchant shipping: steel structures and their degradation, static and dynamic stability of the boat, the roll stability, ventilation systems, and that struck me particularly in that the ship was built for the Alaska run, in which ventilation has rather a different kind of job than it does in the tropical milk run. Scheduling that elevates the risk of human fatigue when things get tricky. Even the morale problems of mariners who know they're doing a vital job in the world's economy, but almost nobody appreciates it. Thought that was a very interesting angle. So do you get some interesting feedback from readers and reviewers on some of these points?
Yeah, certainly. And the most interesting feedback comes from, as I was indicating earlier, from from mariners themselves.
Yeah.
And they tend to have the strongest opinions about this. And again, a lot of them just focus on the captain's wrong decisions. But they work in an industry which in this country is as you were mentioning, not looked down on, but kind of ignored.
Yeah.
The American merchant fleet from the 50s to the present declined by over 80% to where American flagships now constitute less than 1% of the world's fleet. And that has regulatory implications because the Coast Guard in particular oversee American flag ships, and they have very stringent rules. They do a very good job, generally speaking, of keeping track of safety issues. But most ships now, obviously, 99% of them are different flag, and a lot of them don't have the same inspection schedule. Having said that, the El Faro was an old ship built in the 70s, and much older than the average merchant ship. And the ship owners put a lot of pressure on Congress to exempt their ships from the most stringent type regulations.
Right.
They had something called the Alternate Compliance Program, one aspect of which was to leave El Faro and ships of her age with lifeboats that were basically the same as you had on the Titanic.
Right.
And that was a real factor in what happened, because when El Faro did become engaged with a hurricane and she was listing heavily, and waves, 30-foot waves plus, and 110, 120 knot winds were pummeling the ship, the lifeboats she had were useless.
Yeah. Now, would the modern lifeboats with their sort of ski jump, closed lifeboats with their ski jump, would that have survived? Do you think that would have saved everybody, or nearly?
Nobody can know, and in conditions like that, it's impossible to predict, but I think they would have had a chance with those ships, whereas with the lifeboats, they didn't even bother with the lifeboats when when the abandoned ship order was sounded. They went, the captain said, go to the rafts. Yeah. And the rafts, if there was any chance at all, the rafts might have afforded some. But in 130 mile an hour winds, the rafts will just be they'll be kites. Right.
And as you pointed out, there wasn't a surface to the sea in the ordinary sense. Yeah. What looked like air, relatively speaking, was too full of water to breathe and too thick or too thin to swim in.
Yeah, that was something that surprised me. I didn't realize that. But basically, the surface of the waves in that strength wind, you get a kind of emulsion. It's not really an emulsion, but it's a mix of water and air. And when you're breathing that, the water is filling your lungs, and eventually you're not breathing anymore.
Yeah. Returning a little bit to literary issues. One thing struck me was the role of the voice data recorder. In the history of those human disasters that killed all their participants, has there ever been such a complete account of their last words and actions?
You're talking just at sea, or?
Well, at sea primarily, but anywhere.
There must have been. I am not aware of one. This had a voyage recorder, a tape recorder running that recorded from several points on the bridge, and even on the bridge wings, what was being said. Yeah. And there was, to a lesser extent, there was some data about the ship's position and condition, but they ended up having over 21. It was supposed to, I think, run for 21 hours. It ran for more than that. Yeah. And it was like a black box in an airplane. Yeah. And when the ship sank, obviously went with it. The ship sank in 3 miles of water. Yeah. So the Navy actually and Woods Hole Oceanographic ended up being the ones tasked with trying to find the voyage data recorder, and they did, and they managed to retrieve it from 3 miles down, and by some feats of mechanical skill, they retrieved the recording. So you had a record of what everybody said on the bridge. Yeah. For roughly the 24 hours before the ship sank, and that's what made me write the book. Actually, it was because I didn't want to write another shipwreck book. The last novel I'd written was about a shipwreck, actually, and the previous nonfiction book was about navigation across the board, but I focused it a little bit on my great-great-grandfather, who was the captain of a ship off the coast of Norway that went down, and that capsized and went down in the storm. So I wasn't interested in writing about shipwrecks anymore, or being the shipwreck writer. But I was really interested in El Faro. There were people from, there was a chief engineer from Plymouth. Yeah. There were 2 Mass Maritime grads. and another 4 officers from Maine Maritime. You know, the officer contingent was very much New England focused.
Yeah.
And it, you know, to me as a mariner or as a former mariner, it was a fascinating
Sure.
technical issue. What happened to this ship? And you have to remember the first 24, 36 hours, nobody knew what happened. In fact,
Right.
even the Coast Guard captain in charge of the search and rescue didn't think she'd gone down. He was just hoping the radio antennas had been knocked down and
Yeah.
they couldn't transmit, but they would find them or at least find people in lifeboats. And the local media gave it good coverage here on the Cape, so I became interested. But
Yeah.
it wasn't until months later when they retrieved the voyage data recorder, and they published a transcript, and I read this, and it was like reading a play, like reading a Greek tragedy, because you had these people starting off. Well, we know there's a problem out there, but you know it's not going to be a problem, and then talking about stuff like,
Yeah.
you know, the coffee that they're making, and the captain and the first mate talking about office politics and how they both think they're going to be fired, that kind of thing. And then the storm is they're getting closer and closer to the storm, and then the second and third mates are telling the captain. The third mate called the captain at 11 p.m. on the 30th of September. It said, "Captain, I think we got a problem here. We're getting too close to this hurricane. There's one safety route we can take, one escape route." And then the second mate did the same thing around 1 a.m. on the 1st of October, the day the ship sank. Called up the captain in the stateroom again, said we need to do this. Anyway, and you don't hear the other side of the recording. Unfortunately, you don't hear when
Right.
you're on the phone down to the stateroom.
Yeah.
You don't hear the other side. But it's like a play. It's like a tragedy slowly unfolding and getting more and more tense and dramatic. And obviously, I mean, you know it's going to happen.
What struck me is that I
really
don't think
effective.
any TV or movie scriptwriter would write the dialogue like that. I think the dialogue that you quote here is it's a bunch of folks doing their job the best way they know how. Nobody gets into a cowardice problem. Nobody gets into a hero situation. They just all try to get their job done and hope it's good enough.
You kind of have to read between the lines, but it's really interesting how much character you can dredge out from that, because, as you say, a lot of it's just casual talk. It wouldn't be in the script because so much of it is incidental, and the script will focus down on it.
Right.
But you do get really interesting stuff. At one point, the second mate quotes from Scooby-Doo, the cartoon, and says "ruh-roh," because she's seeing something that she doesn't like.
Right.
Captain Davidson, on the other hand, is really optimistic, and it's part of his master's personality. It's also part of his own personality, I think, where we're going to get through this. Come on, guys, we're all set. And he doesn't utter a negative comment until around 6 a.m.
Yeah.
Which is an hour and a half before the ship sinks, and the ship is in real trouble at that point. She's listing.
Yeah.
She's about to lose power. And they know there's a problem with the engine because the oil is not getting sufficiently into the turbines to lubricate, and if that happens, to a certain extent, the engines will stop, which is what happened. Yeah. And he knows there's serious problems, but not until around 6 does he say anything negative. And what he says is something flies off and hits the bridge or the accommodation, and he says, "There goes the lawn furniture." That's the first negative thing he says.
That's right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Before that, it's all, we're going to shoot under the hurricane. Don't worry about it. Or this ship can take it.
Okay. Yeah. One thing, slightly different technical angle. I expected to find some indication that continuing to use the obsolete technology of steam propulsion contributed to the problems, but I didn't find that. It looks like the advantage of diesel motors is mainly economic, greater energy efficiency. Do you agree with that?
Well, there's a lot of advantages to diesel versus steam, and it's not just economic. I mean, steam's more complex. It's also more interesting to an engineer, and there were again this Greek tragedy aspect of it. The chief engineer, Pusateri, Jeff Matthias, who was also a chief in charge of some conversion work on the ship, came from Plymouth, Mass. And one of the third engineers were fascinated with steam. And in fact, the chief engineer used to say, I can't remember exactly, but it was something like, if you want to repair cars, go diesel. If you want to be an engineer, go steam.
I remember that.
Because it's actually, steam is a beautiful kind of cyclical system that oddly mirrors some of the aspects of the hurricane in terms of pressure, gradient pressure, and then condensation. That's kind of the way a hurricane works. But you're right. The propulsion mechanism didn't come directly into the evolution of the tragedy, as it were. The ship had problems in that the steam engine was as old as the ship, so 40-odd years old, and the boilers had problems. The pipes in which the water runs to get heated were starting to bow out. The brick walls lining the boilers were starting to also bow out. The ship was actually due to be placed on a watch list by the Coast Guard on the day she sank, because there were enough things going wrong that the Coast Guard wanted to bring her into a higher level of alert, keep a little bit sharper eye on her, which was a little bit ironic, to say the least. But again, the propulsion machinery, in and of itself, didn't really contribute to the tragedy, except in the sense that there was a problem with the lubrication, which had nothing to do with the steam per se. But again, that oil that needed to be lubricating the turbines was a key factor.
And they didn't have enough oil on board to meet the situation.
Well, technically, they did. They had a 10-ton reserve tank that could be used to basically solve the problem, which I'll now describe, which is that there's a sump where, like a car, where the oil collects, and then there's a pump that recirculates oil over the turbines. And in normal weather, there was plenty of oil. There was 27 inches of oil, 25 inches of oil in the sump. The minimum was 18, and the recommended was 28 inches. The trouble happens when a ship starts to list to one side. The pipe was on one side of center line, which I've had a problem with in my own boat, by the way. Oh, really? The pipe was 22 inches on the starboard side, which meant that if you were listening to port, and the list was the original problem, was because water was coming in through.
Let me just get to one other point before we're running out of time here. If I were in charge of picking textbooks for schools like our own Mass Maritime Academy, I'd sure take a good look at this one. Have you seen any of that? Is there anything like that in this book's future?
I have no idea. I think Mass Maritime has a lot of textbooks that are way more precise and have to do with their actual training. I mean, I think this is a good read. I mean, it's a really exciting read, but more to the point, I think it really illustrates how all these different factors can come together.
It really does.
Problems.
Well, anyhow, I'd like to thank you very much for coming to Books in the World.
Oh, thank you.
Enjoyed this very much.
You too. Thank you.